Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Andrew Samwick. I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth. Thank you for coming to our program in honor of Veterans Day, in which we're proud to feature Dartmouth's President Emeritus, James Wright, who holds the Eleazar Wheelock Professor of History. As such, he needs little formal introduction, but I would like to begin in a manner that many of us at Dartmouth would begin when introducing him, which is to say thank you. Each person at Dartmouth has a different thank you for Jim Wright. Everyone's would be a little different. Mine runs something like this. Through his service, first as Associate Dean of the Faculty for Social Sciences, and later in his terms as the Dean of the Faculty, the Provost, and the President, Jim Wright has been a thoughtful supporter of the Rockefeller Center and its mission as an interdisciplinary social science center that engages the community in scholarship and teaching on critical matters of public policy and helps to develop the leadership potential of Dartmouth students. So thank you, Jim. There's very little here that we do at the Rockefeller Center that doesn't owe itself in some way to your hard work, and it's been an honor to be a part of this community to which you have contributed so much. The Rockefeller Center has been commemorating Veterans Day since 2005 with public programs focusing on the military, national defense, and homeland security. Over the lifetime of many people in this room, but critically not the students, and it seems every year fewer and fewer of the faculty, the public relationship between civil society and the military has changed dramatically, and many would say improved. Gone, generally, are the days in which there was disgraceful public treatment of returning veterans who bore the brunt of criticisms that properly belong with the leaders of the military and their civilian counterparts. Certainly this characterized the immediate post-Vietnam War era. Quite to the contrary, the pendulum has swung very far in the opposite direction, to the point where our appropriate insistence on not criticizing the men and women who serve in the military may be inappropriately giving their military leaders, and especially their civilian counterparts, too little scrutiny for how they are deploying our military across the world. It is an old but true saying that ethics is what you do when nobody is watching, or in the realm of public policy, when nobody is really paying attention. As prior Veterans Day speakers have argued, the military has protected itself as an institution in the post-Vietnam era by developing into an organization that does not rely on the broad sacrifice of the whole country to undertake its missions. While this may make for a more effective military in some narrow sense, the disconnection from the broader society makes it easier for society to avoid the hard questions that any military mission entails. Specifically, while our treatment of veterans in public discourse has become more respectful, our treatment of them where it may have mattered most, in providing adequate facilities and support for physical recovery from wartime injuries, and social support for transitions into productive civilian lives, this was found wanting in the years in the immediate aftermath of Afghanistan and Iraq. A Marine himself and someone with a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunities he has enjoyed, President Wright began a series of visits to military medical facilities in Washington in 2005, where he met and spoke candidly with wounded veterans. In 25 visits over the last 6 years, he has encouraged injured servicemen and women to continue their education. He has joined in establishing and has assumed responsibility for raising funds to support an educational counseling program for wounded U.S. veterans. This program is now being offered through the American Council on Education. President Wright worked with Senators Jim Webb, John Warner, and Chuck Hagel on the language of the GI Bill that was passed by Congress and signed by President Bush in June 2008. His contribution to the bill was to secure a means for private institutions to partner with Veterans Affairs in supporting veterans who matriculated at these institutions through the Yellow Ribbon Program. Through his work, President Wright has made Dartmouth a leader among its peer institutions in helping to address the needs of wounded veterans. In an essay in just today's issue of Inside Higher Ed, President Wright is quoted as follows: "I think that since most Americans are not sacrificing anything for these wars, we have a shared obligation to extend a hand to those who are sacrificing. We need to encourage veterans to pursue educational opportunities and provide the means for them to do this. and elite institutions have a special obligation to do this. We are privileged, and with this privilege comes a responsibility. In his lecture today, President Wright will provide more context and understanding for this challenging issue. In his new book, Those Who Have Borne the Battle, A History of America's Wars and Those Who Fought Them, he describes the burdens carried by veterans throughout our history and challenges Americans to do a better job for those who serve and sacrifice today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jim Wright.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a treat for me to be back in this room, standing down here. I taught a lot of classes in this room over the years, and it's particularly a privilege, Andrew, to come and to participate in your celebration of Veterans Day. I commend you for doing this over the last several years. 2 years ago, on Veterans Day, I spoke at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. It was a rainy and cool day, the type of weather that keeps away all but the committed for outdoor activities. But the committed were there. Vietnam veterans in business suits, wearing faded fatigues, in wheelchairs, and on motorcycles. And in the front row sat a group of Gold Star mothers wearing white and almost glowing in this rainy, misty day. I spoke about the importance of something such as this wall to encourage us to remember those who sacrificed. And I particularly talked about two names who were on the wall, one of them Billy Smoyer, a Dartmouth graduate. All of us have a responsibility to help remember those who fought and served. We need to set their memories and remember that those of us who knew them will not be around forever to remind people who they were and what they did. Last year on Veterans Day, I spoke at Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea. I spoke there to a young, largely Korean university community, and I focused on Americans who had served in the Korean War and about the ways in which this war had become a forgotten war to most Americans, with the consequence that those who had served there had become forgotten veterans. I also had the opportunity when I was there, happening along with the Marine Corps birthday, to join the Marine Corps birthday ball that was hosted by the commanding general of the Marine Corps forces in Korea. And the honored guests at the Marine Corps ball a year ago were veterans from the 1st Marine Division who had fought in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir 60 years before that. They remembered, they surely remembered where they had been and what they did. Today I'm honored to speak here at home and to share some comments based on my work over the last 6 years, visiting with wounded veterans at military hospitals, working with others to help put in place programs to provide support for them, and finally stepping back once more as a historian to reflect upon the ways in which Americans, from the American Revolution down to Afghanistan, the way Americans have thought about and the way Americans have mobilized for war, and the attitudes we have had toward those who have fought our wars. I intend in these remarks this afternoon to describe for you the historical record, the national narrative, which is not always the same thing, and then share some observations about our current situation. I discovered in preparing for this, it's hard to summarize a 400-page book in a 40-minute lecture, but I shall try. Defining wars as major declared or sustained engagements from the Revolution through Operation Desert Storm in 1990 and 91, some 42 million Americans have served during our nation's wars. It does not mean that they are all in the front lines or in combat or even left their base near home, but 42 million have wartime service. Of these, 651,000 have died in battles from the Revolution down through Operation Desert Storm. Another 309,000 died in the theater of operations from illness or non-combat injuries or accidents. And finally, another 230,000 died in wartime service, but not in the theaters of war. About 1.4 million have suffered physical casualties, non-mortal wounding in combat theaters during these wars. And this definition has changed. I think during the Revolution, it was hard for anyone to be considered a casualty if you had all of your limbs. Obviously, that has evolved over the years. But it's interesting to note that only in World War II did combat deaths exceed non-combat deaths. In all of the earlier wars, including World War I, death from disease and accidents took heavy tolls, more than were actually killed in combat. According to government figures, as of this past spring, there were 223.5 million living veterans in the United States. 17.5 million of those were wartime veterans. And these figures, by the way, do include those veterans of our current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I think that there is a problem with these kinds of compilations, as necessary as they may be to summarize magnitude or patterns. Grand summaries lead to grand abstractions. Numbers that are aggregated and events that are combined and compressed manage to rob war of its essential component, that is, individuals who are exposed to risks and individuals who are asked to do sometimes some horrible things. War has a very human quality, and it's marked by a pattern of very human sacrifice. We should never, ever, ever allow war not to have a human face. People in combat become consumed with tactical problems and personal needs. In the final accounting, stripped of everything, of weaponry and of tactics, combat becomes intensely personal. Within the framework of an immediate tactical military objective, within a military unit with clear hierarchy and crisp differentiation of authority and responsibility, within this framework, combat is about simply staying alive, about protecting and aiding those in your unit, and about always the potential for deadly confrontations with those who share with you the impulse for their own self-preservation. A study of those who fought in America's wars that was published recently described the constant overriding desire to survive, regardless of the purpose of war or the nature of combat. Most human beings learn as infants to remember two constant things. First, to look out for themselves, to avoid any threatening risks or dangers, and secondly, not to harm another human being. And the latter is emphasized under threat of law as well as under moral code and religious teachings. When young men and women now are mobilized for war, those who train them have to impose upon them a sense of discipline and focus which enables those in combat to subordinate these fundamental teachings when the situation demands it. That their priority cannot be simply to stay alive and not put themselves in situations of risk, and it cannot be not to hurt another human being. Their task, indeed, is to hurt other human beings. When they are demobilized, they are told to return now to the first rules, go back and become a civilian again, and forget what they have just learned, and to wipe from their memory all of the contrary experiences and observations that they've had. In each instance, this is impossible. In the first, learning how to take risks, learning how to be willing to kill another human being is sufficiently successful to engage in winning wars. But the latter, I think, unlearning what one has just done or observed or experienced may not be possible for anyone who has encountered the horror of war. One does not simply shut this off and forget it. It's not in a compartment put away. This is a major burden that we place upon those whom we ask to serve in our wars. In our democracy, we have rationalized this by talking about our shared responsibility and burden. If we do not all serve individually, when we find ourselves in a war. We all join, we believe, in sacrificing on behalf of those who do serve. And our children, or the boy or girl next door or down the street, they serve. We have developed an American narrative that summarizes this. It's a narrative that surely is based on some elements of the American experience, but it's also based on some sweeping generalizations and some often erroneous generalizations. During the American Revolution, George Washington spoke of the obligation of all citizens in these colonies which sought to be free. Every citizen, he stated, who enjoys the protection of a free government owes not only a proportion of his property, but even of his personal services to the defense of it, and consequently that the citizens of America, with a few legal and official exceptions, from 18 to 50 years of age, should be born in the militia rolls. This principle of obligation, a belief widely shared by the revolutionary generation, became a cornerstone value in the American Republic. Moreover, it was such an important cornerstone value that we even began thinking that it was actually the case. From Lexington and Concord, to Gettysburg, to Belleau Woods, to the beach at Normandy, the story confirms that American citizens have stood at the ready, always prepared, or at least always prepared to become prepared. In 1940, when European war threatened to engage the United States again, Senator Bob Reynolds of North Carolina warned him not to take lightly American boys who grew up with squirrel rifles in their hands. As someone who did grow up with a squirrel rifle, I have to acknowledge it never occurred to me that I was prepared to take on a Panzer division someplace. Needless to say, that is not the point, nor is it the theme of this narrative. It is that Americans, we believe, have been reluctant warriors, but they are ready when called upon. In the telling, they have stepped up for their country's wars, and just as soon as the war ends, they return to their civilian lives. They are not militaristic. Rather, they are good citizens who take on the obligations of a democracy. This tale is marked by some exaggeration, of course, but also contains some errors. Most importantly, among these, with the possible exception of World War II, there has historically not been massive enthusiasm for volunteering for war that the story implies. The reluctance to serve, in fact, began as early as the American Revolution. It began at the beginning. George Washington was very frustrated in the absence of volunteers to serve in his Continental Army. This army that he commanded and became, finally by the end of the war, really a quite skilled fighting force, this was not representative of the colonies or of colonial society. Its ranks were not filled with shopkeepers and farmers, as the legend would suggest. Poorer citizens who did not hold property and thus could not even vote in most colonies were the ones who often took up arms, often following the payment of some generous enlistment bonus that their colonial governments made available to them. Virginia, when it was struggling to maintain a force to fight with Washington, the Continental Army, as the campaign moved more to the south, finally to Yorktown, Virginia even considered and in fact passed legislation that would give a slave as a bonus to anyone who would enlist in the Army and serve. They so badly needed people to sign up. This caused a Virginian, James Madison, to wonder if it would not be less complicated and less expensive to simply free slaves who would then go on to fight in the war. Nonetheless, despite this fact, the citizen soldier, the militiaman, the willing volunteer, this became the iconic symbol of America's wartime participants. Even those who used the story recognized its limits. As a Massachusetts congressman said in 1808, the idea of using the militia as the force and ready, quote, will do very well on paper. It sounds well in the war speeches on this floor to talk about every soldier being a citizen and every citizen being a soldier, and to declaim that the militia of our country is the bulwark of our liberty is very captivating. All this will figure to advantage in history, but it will not do at all in practice. It did not do well in practice. Certainly in our wars, historically, the war fighting has not been equitably shared. Wars of massive mobilization, such as the Civil War, required large bonuses and sometimes social pressures, if not coercion, to get people to sign up in a volunteer regiment or company. The two world wars in the 20th century did elicit enthusiastic volunteers, but these were not sustained. In order to maintain the personnel needs of the military, they had to, in each war, very quickly move to a mandatory draft. Moreover, as the nature of military and of combat became more technologically complicated, people came to recognize that it was not an easy transition from a squirrel rifle to automatic weapons. Most early militia units were filled with amateurs, and they were not prepared for long enlistments. They did well in defending their home colonies or territory, including Bunker Hill and Concord. They did well, but the idea of them becoming a force in the field for a year or two was not something that they were prepared to sign up and do. George Washington concluded in frustration, to place any dependence upon the militia is assuredly resting upon a broken staff. Even in wartime, only a small part of the population has served in the military. One study estimated that about 3% of the total population served in the military during the Civil War. The Confederate states would have had a higher percentage than the Union states. And roughly the same percentage of about 3% served in the First World War. In 1945, the last year of World War II, about 10% of the United States population was in the military. This was the highest it had been in any of our wars. In Korea, it was about 2%. And in the Vietnam War, it was less than 2%. And today, for comparison, about 1/2% of our population serves in the military. The great American narrative of citizens leaving farms and factories and shops to mobilize for war was substantiated by World War II. This is that case that does substantiate in many ways the historic narrative. It was a model of success, and of course it's a model of success that has continuing consequences for those of us who are the children or grandchildren of that generation. And they can point to that and say, this is the way it works in America. There was a massive mobilization by war's end. Americans fought bravely and well in a cruel war on land and sea and air. But the World War II military was built by the draft, and it was a remarkably fair and comprehensive system. Few exemptions were provided under the draft in World War II, and few deferments were provided. And the major ones that were available were occupational for wartime industries, and these were extended most commonly to farmers. There were no educational deferments during the Second World War, except in a few specific categories, some fields that people had defined related to engineering or some other field that they wanted somebody to finish their education before they were drafted and called up. College officials pushed very hard for occupational or for student deferments during the war because they're worried about their campuses simply closing down. And the Roosevelt administration resisted this. As Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Hershey, the Deputy Director of Selective Service, said, "Is the college student per se of more importance than the automobile mechanic or farm laborer who is now working and producing?" The answer on the part of government was no. And many schools, including Dartmouth, began then to host military programs to survive. Except for the V-12 program, which was based here during the war, Dartmouth would have shut down during World War II. In fact, Dartmouth had the largest V-12 Navy and Marine Corps officer training program in the country on this campus. To underline the comprehensiveness of the mobilization through enlistment and the draft, most of the regularly matriculated Dartmouth classes in the war years had about 90% participation in the military, which is quite remarkable. 9 of 10 of them were in the war, really beginning as early as the winter of 1942. 310 Dartmouth men died during the Second World War. The average serviceman serving in World War II had completed more years of education than had their civilian counterparts. One careful student of the draft concluded that, quote, the best and the brightest did not evade service during this war. Another study confirmed the absence of educational or economic bias in combat, and a comprehensive review of casualties in World War II suggested that higher income and better educated communities had the highest casualties during the war. I believe this is partially the result of the draft, but it also was the fact that there were very high casualties in the Air Force and the Navy. And the Air Force and the Navy did have more young men coming from better, stronger, more economically thriving communities to serve in those forces. Charles Milton Pearson, Stubby Pearson, graduated from Dartmouth in 1942. He was a native of Madison, Minnesota, and he excelled in college as a student and as an athlete. In fact, he was the captain of both the football and basketball teams, and he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. He was the valedictorian for the class of 1942, which graduated early in the spring of 1942 in order for the members of that class to go off to war. 91% of the class, Dartmouth class of 42, would serve in the armed forces. Speaking at his commencement ceremony, Pearson urged that no one feel sorry for his generation. We are not sorry for ourselves. Today we are happy. We have a duty to perform, and we are proud to perform it. He reminded his class that their task was to end the war and then to go on to make the world a better place for everyone. A tomorrow, he said, a tomorrow with a ray of sunshine more bright than we've ever seen before. He hoped to go and complete his service and come back and teach or work in education in order to help accomplish this. As a Navy pilot in the Pacific, Stubby Pearson wrote home that he did not want anyone ever to make it appear that war was a glamorous thing. He said it's not glorious. It's a dirty, predatory, slimy job that must be done. He was the recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross for his performance in naval battles at Truk and Peleliu. He died in the latter place when his SBT Dauntless dive bomber was hit by anti-aircraft fire while attacking a Japanese destroyer. 33 of his Dartmouth classmates, 5% of the number who had matriculated here in the fall of 1938 as freshmen, 33 of them would also die in that war. In the Korean War, there was the beginning of a shift away from the equity of sacrifice that had marked World War II. First of all, the Congress, when they renewed the draft, permitted draft boards to provide for educational deferments. They are not categorical, but it was left to each draft board to make a determination. Nearly 75% of college students were able to secure deferments because of this. Secondly, unlike World War II, the Congress permitted the continuation of voluntary enlistments. During World War II, they had stopped voluntary enlistments for anyone who was draft eligible, which because the Army was particularly concerned that people were joining the Navy and the Marine Corps rather than the Army, and they wanted to make certain that they would have a chance for these same young men through the draft. And so what happened with the Navy and the Marine Corps is a lot of 17-year-olds who were not draft eligible still chose to join those services. Also, with the allowing the volunteer enlistment to continue, it's true that volunteers did not come from a cross-section of society. So as a result of having educational deferments and the high proportion of volunteers, those who fought in Korea were not as representative of society as was the World War II military. But this gap widened significantly with the Vietnam War. Categorical educational deferments were possible then. It was not up to individual draft boards. It was a categorical educational deferment. And this was increasingly greater. And so what happened is that, first of all, those who were college students or college graduates were not equitably represented in the military. There was even greater inequity among those who were deployed to Vietnam, and service in combat units in Vietnam had the greatest inequities of all. These tended not to be representative of our society, in fact, far from it. Vietnam casualties were disproportionately working class and black, and they were young. The average age of those who served in combat in Vietnam was 19. In World War II, the average age was 27. One study at the conclusion of the Vietnam War determined that young men growing up in blue-collar South Boston were 20 times more likely to die in Vietnam than were their counterparts, the same age group a few miles to the north, who were enrolled at Harvard and MIT. There were 15 Dartmouth names on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. There are another 6 who died in service during the Vietnam era, 5 of them in airplane crashes or other accidents in the States during training, so their names are not on the wall, but they are wartime casualties. And there was one man that I am still trying to do work on. His name should be on the wall. He died in a hospital in the United States, but it was a result of injuries he suffered in Vietnam, and his name should be on the wall, and I hope someday to get it there. In 1973, the United States moved to end the draft and to go to what was called all volunteer armed forces. It was a logical and it was a defensible step. The military would certainly need an even smaller proportion of the population, so any selection system, be it draft or anything else, would be liable to charges of bias and unfairness. Nonetheless, the military, particularly the Army, was apprehensive about maintaining troop levels without the draft as a direct source of recruits or as an indirect source of recruits. Some studies have determined that about half of those people who voluntarily enlisted during the war in Vietnam were doing it because they had the draft coming at them and they wanted to choose the time and the branch of service where they would serve rather than wait for the draft. And so all of the services were concerned without having this draft incentive. Certainly, the military had great difficulty moving to the all-volunteer Army, but after several years of struggle to meet numerical and then quality goals, the system has largely worked as a source of needed personnel. The all-volunteer military, that which we see today in the field, has tended to be more middle class or lower middle class than poor, which many people had predicted early on. It has not been dominated by minorities as many had predicted. Whites and blacks have been overrepresented, but Asian and Hispanic Americans have not been. They've been underrepresented in the military based on their proportion of the population. Rural and small-town Americans have been disproportionately represented, and conversely, of course, urban Americans have not served proportionately. The rural West, Southerners, white and black, these are the most overrepresented groups in the military today. The demographic pattern has been sharpened as clearly there's something going on where those people who are the sons or daughters of veterans or live next door to veterans are more likely to enlist and to join up in the all-volunteer Army. And as communities have fewer and fewer veterans in them, there's not this sort of leverage going on. A year or two ago, in fact, Vermont was that state of the 50 states that had the highest proportion of young men and women killed in Iraq and Afghanistan as a proportion of the total population of the state. It has not, if you look at the major urban states, they don't come anywhere close to meeting this. One of the most fundamental differences in the new military is the proportion of women and the wide range of responsibilities they now assume and the leadership that they provide. It was not until 1967, in fact, that the Congress eliminated the limit of 2% on women serving in the military and the provision that women could not serve at the rank of colonel or general. Finally, in 1967, women were permitted to be promoted where their merit would take them. Congress voted to admit women to the service academies in 1975, and 1978 abolished the separate Women's Army Corps. But restrictions on women serving in combat units continue, and they continue today. What's happening today, though, is that it's no longer clear where the combat units in the front lines are, and there are, I think, 120 women who are casualties who have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. A year ago, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates warned that our society, quote, should not ignore the broader long-term consequences of waging these protracted military campaigns, employing and re-employing such a small portion of our society in the effort. Secretary Gates noted that there was a narrow sliver of the population that was serving, and he pointed out that, quote, those attending and graduating from our nation's most selective and academically demanding universities were not represented in the military today. Certainly, the military today, the ranks are filled with remarkably strong and even professional enlisted men and women. But as historically, as fewer Americans have served in the military, there has been a compensatory idealization of those who did serve. And so ironically, even as historically we're insisting that these are all of us, we recognize they were not all of us, and so we began to celebrate their specialness. They were not every man, they were heroes. And you can see this in some of the rhetoric early in the 19th century about the Revolutionary War generation. Rather than simply acknowledging their service, they were heroic for having served. And certainly, those who died by definition had made a heroic sacrifice on behalf of their nation. With the final sacrifice, they represent America's best values. They symbolize service to the Republic, unselfishness, and courage. Remembering them well was an important part of the narrative of contemporary society. The better they were, the better we are. In Thucydides' telling, Pericles touched on this very theme millennia earlier in his funeral oration, reminding Athenians of their ties to those who had died in the service of their society. He said, in the briefest moment, at the turning point of their fortune, they took their leave not of fear, but of glory. Such were these men, and they proved worthy of their city. The rest of us may pray for a safer outcome, but should demand of ourselves a determination against the enemy no less courageous than theirs. These dead Athenian soldiers were worthy of Athens. So the remembered veterans of the American Revolution were as well. Their spirit and their glory early in the 19th century became worthy of their cause, and implicitly they are worthy of their descendants. If we did not all serve, those who did serve represented all of us, and they verified our values. Military service in the face of threat became a defining quality of American patriotism. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency of a nation now fully splintered as a consequence of Southern reaction to his election. In his inaugural address, he embraced the interpretation of the country's shared and proud history, tying patriotism to military service as both a unifying appeal to the seceding South and, as necessary, as a call to the northern states to be prepared to affirm their responsibility for the dearly bought heritage of this republic. Lincoln said, though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. The national narrative by 1861, then, had incorporated fully and warmly this mystic memory of citizen soldiers representing all of us, defending the land. Just 2.5 years later, at the dedication of the ceremony at the Gettysburg battlefield, Lincoln built some more upon this theme. He said, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. Lincoln's words, as we all know, were profoundly moving, yet they were also fundamentally impersonal. He did not call up reminders of blood and of bodies, of lives and dreams that were ended in an instant. No generals, no officers, no soldiers, no names of individuals, of places, or of fights on that battlefield. None of them appeared in his remarks. There are no individual heroes cited. Instead, there was a poignant and poetic reminder of heroic sacrifice by many, which underlined their devotion to and sacrifice for a greater purpose. The president celebrated the narrative of heroic democracy, defining the war as a cause engaged in for the basic principles of the nation, and embracing the war dead, undifferentiated and anonymous, but heroes all. The Second World War provided an opportunity to take this narrative of heroic service to a new level. This was, in Tom Brokaw's widely accepted phrase, the greatest generation. It set the bar remarkably high, in my mind. It is hard to exceed the superlative. The Korean War was an unpleasant interlude following World War II, and most Americans worked hard to forget it. Vietnam was impossible to forget. But in the public telling, this war, rather than a heroic greatest generation, was marked by veterans who were viewed as victims of a war that was wrong. And how often in the rhetoric would call those who served in Vietnam as victims themselves. And it's a fairly condescending concept. Today, fewer and fewer Americans even know anyone who is serving in the military. It's interesting to me to observe the ways in which the American public has embraced the servicemen and women and the veterans of the current wars. These wars, after all, in Iraq and Afghanistan, are no more popular than was the war in Vietnam. And yet, instead of the previous pattern of ignoring the Vietnam veteran, or worse, in our treatment of them, those who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan are embraced as heroes, even if we don't really know them and really don't quite know what it is that they are doing. And the generic use of heroism to define all who serve further restricts the language to identify the truly heroic. One recent commentator pointed out, it's a lot easier to idealize the people who are fighting than it is to send your kid to join them. Today, we're saving many servicemen and women who would have died in earlier wars. An expansion of medevac crews and the positioning of them in field hospitals closer to combat units, as well as protective gear that the men and women are wearing in the field, and the remarkable improvements in military medicine are saving lives. And when I go to the hospitals, I'm confronted regularly by people who are missing significant body parts, who are in tradition of just terrible pain and discomfort, who have major holes in their bodies from which pus and blood is running out. And they're alive. We're saving them, and they're gonna go on. The lives are often marked by significant injuries, and we celebrate their courage. Those who are confined to wheelchairs or have prostheses are nearly rock stars when they are spotlighted at ball games or other public events. Perhaps most of you have seen this happen someplace or another, when finally someone will announce, and we have some veterans from the local hospital here, and there'll be somebody in wheelchairs, or some people with prostheses or missing limbs, and everyone will stand up and applaud them warmly. It is inspiring to be at those occasions. But as strange as this may sound, it is also a little bit troubling in one sense. These are not sustainable moments. These are not sustainable moments. Frank Woodruff Buckles died this past winter at the age of 110. Buckles was the last living American veteran of World War I. He was born in Missouri, and he was 16 years old, living on a farm in Oklahoma. When the war began, he lied about his age in order to get into the Army. He signed up as an ambulance driver because he understood that was a way to get to France quickly. He served in this capacity during the war, but he was not directly in any combat situation. When World War II began, Buckles was in Manila working for a steamship company, and he was imprisoned by the Japanese. He was liberated by Americans in 1945, having lost 50 pounds in prison camp. Surely some young Americans now serving or yet to serve in Iraq or Afghanistan will live to be as old as Buckles. So the last of these warriors will die in 2105 or something like that. The music will have died, The rock star music will have died for them well before that. My fear is that while we are saving and medically providing for the seriously injured young veterans, some may become wards of the state, many of them for a long, long time, and we have to find ways to do better than that. They surely can and wish to do better than that. For all of the state-of-the-art medical systems in place, which is inadequately provided in the Department of Defense and Veterans Administration hospitals and elsewhere in the support system for veterans, is a rich, comprehensive counseling system. We need better counseling to work with these young men and women. They need to be reminded and encouraged to reach beyond their condition. They need job counseling and training and educational counseling and opportunity and vocational rehabilitation programs that will encourage them to dream for more and enable them to reach those dreams. Beyond that, what is needed is more support for families who function as caretakers, more renovation to make homes accessible and usable, and customized motor vehicles for transportation in order to enable independence. The citizen soldiers of this generation are entitled to no less. In the spring of 2010, a government employee, Colleen Getz, waited at Washington Reagan Airport for a flight to Florida. The airline representative announced right before they're getting ready to board that the plane was filled and requested volunteers to surrender their seats to travelers who were then on standby. Volunteers would receive compensation for doing this, and they could be on the next flight. We've all sat and listened to these pitches asking us to do that. No one stepped forward when the request was first made. Then the representative got on the microphone again and said that the seats were needed for a family who were just returning from Dover Air Force Base, where they received the body of their son, a Marine who had been killed in Afghanistan. The family was taking him home on this flight. Colleen Getz and two other people immediately volunteered to give up their seats, but there were 6 family members. The airline representative asked several times for additional volunteers, and the family stood near him, as one described it, quote, dignified and mute, weighed with grief and fatigue during these repeated pleas for somebody to allow them to get on the plane with their son. After 20 or so minutes of this, the representative asked, with his voice breaking, "This young man gave his life for our country. Can't any of you give your seats so his family can go home with him?" A few minutes later, the additional passenger stepped forward. Dr. Getz wrote of this experience, and she wrote of her fellow passengers kindly. She said it was not that they did not think it was the right thing to do. Rather, it was because they were busy trying to assimilate this unexpected confrontation with the irrevocable cost of war, and to figure out how to fit doing the right thing into their plans, to fit it into their lives not previously touched by this war. There is little doubt that most Americans are interested in doing, quote, the right thing for veterans. But most Americans, most of us, have no clear sense of what this right thing might be, for few Americans are touched by these wars. For many, they are video games almost, with drones and with nameless young Americans whose very identity is shielded by protective gear, fighting it out over there someplace for something that we don't always remember how it started and what it is that it's about. Wars are by definition exercises in sacrifice, sometimes significant sacrifice. In these wars, the sacrifice is not shared, but someone's spouse, children, friends, is sacrificed. This is an inevitable cost of war. We need all recognize that while we don't share in that cost, we are not free of responsibility. In March of 1865, Abraham Lincoln stood at the Capitol for his second inauguration. The country was wearied by war, but was optimistic that it would soon end, as even as Lincoln spoke, Grant was finally chasing down Lee in Virginia. He was weary, he was tired, but he was elated. And this weary, tired, elated president would die in a month before he could see the conclusion of this war. He was magnanimous, but he was firm when he said on this occasion, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in and to bind up the nation's wounds." But he went on in lines that are not quoted as commonly as malice toward none. He went on to remind Americans of another burden, one that inevitably comes with war and one that needs to be shared. He asked that now, quote, "all care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." I think that Veterans Day is a good occasion to remind ourselves that this burden now is ours, of this generation. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd be happy to try to answer questions, and some of you may have some observations. There are a number of veterans in this audience today, and if you have observations, we would all be enriched by them.
Please wait for the mic.
Please wait for the mic.
Jim, thank you for a very
Jerry,
balanced.
Jerry, just take the mic. Yeah.
Jim, thank you very much for a very balanced recitation of our history and its effect on our veterans and their position in the wars. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Semper Fi. Yeah?
Jim, we discussed this, talked about a week ago. Would you comment on the absence of Vietnam on the Dartmouth War Memorial?
Yeah, you asked me that, and I said I don't do memorials
On the
anymore.
Dartmouth Vietnam Memorial,
Yeah.
the words Vietnam were intentionally left off that
Yeah,
plaque.
and I didn't know that till you told me that last week, and I'm not sure. I can certainly raise it. It should be there, and in fact, I'm surprised it's not, and that I never noticed it, and nobody ever pointed out to me before. We did that with the Korean War, as you know. It was only in 1998 that Congress declared the Korean War a war, and at first, the markers for those who were killed in Korea simply gave where they, when they died, and then they started to talk about a Korean conflict, and finally it was acknowledged to be a war. But I can't answer that. We had a lot of Dartmouth graduates serve in Vietnam, not as many as World War II. It's hard to get those sorts of data. I would say it's more like 10 to 15% probably of graduating classes served in the military at that time. Today it's a handful, 3 or 4 or 5 out of each class.
Can you stand in front of the mic? Any other questions? Would you favor mandatory military service for every citizen?
No, that's almost a logical conclusion of some of the things that I'm concerned about just how unrepresentative the military is today. The problem is with trying to have some sort of mandatory service. I mean, first of all, mandatory service means everybody serves someplace. 100% of 18-year-olds serve someplace. And I'm not sure that this country has the bureaucratic infrastructure to even begin to do that. The military would not need but a small fraction of them. The military today is, the size of it is about equivalent to 3% of the population in the United States between the ages of 15 and 24. That's a census category that doesn't totally overlap, obviously, with military age, but it's close. About 3% of them would serve. I don't know how a draft would pick that 3% who would serve. It may become more representative, perhaps, but it certainly would not affect all communities in the country. And what's going on now, if you talk to military leaders, officers, NCO, generals, they have people who want to be there, and that's a positive. And this really This sort of army came out of Milton Friedman, really, and some conservative economic thinkers in the late 60s and 70s, saying that, you know, there should be a market that decides who it is going to enlist, what they're going to do. Adam Smith was saying some of the same things in the 1780s and 90s, as a matter of fact. I don't know how it would work, but I do think that it's inequitable today. I wrote something this summer that I'd shared with Andrew. We're saying at least we can help pay for it. The quote from Washington had us signing up with our bodies and our treasure, and we're not signing up with our bodies nor with our treasure. This is the first war. These are the first wars in American history where there has not been some sort of a tax or surtax to pay for the wars. We have engaged in these wars on debt, is what we have done, and that means that these guys who are fighting over in Iraq and Afghanistan can come home and help pay for the debt. And ironically, during the Korean War, when President Truman pushed for new taxes to help pay for the war, and the Congress finally approved it reluctantly, but the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn from Texas, said, we need to pay for this war now. We can't ask these young men who are serving in Korea to come back after serving in combat and then pay for their war. We should pay for it for them, and that's not happening, obviously, today. So it makes it even, it gives us even less of a touch or an engagement with these wars that we're fighting today, and I just think it's very unfortunate. Yes.
Probably have a lot of folks, but I want to thank you, President Wright. And my father was in the class of 44. My dad was in the class of 44 at Dartmouth, and when he passed away, there was a memorial that they do at reunions for people who had passed away since the last reunion. And one of the things that struck me was that it seemed an awful lot of the men had served together. They were in the same planes, they were in the same ships. I'm first of all wondering if that was true or that just happened to be that, a particular group of men, and secondly, what a profound difference there is now in where people are coming from who fight.
Yeah, I'm not, most units in World War II, the vast majority of them were not marked by any sort of connection. So they were fairly random. The Civil War was that, you know, the New Hampshire and Vermont Volunteers. Beginning with the First World War, there was a sense that these, and Pershing pushed very hard for this, that these are part of the nation's army. They're not part of a Vermont force that's fighting, and so I would be surprised in cases where some of these fought together. If you look, the class of 42 is just completing a book where they have memories of all of the surviving members of that class who are in World War II, and I've read the draft of this, and certainly a lot of them were killed in the same places. Several of them were Marines that were killed at Iwo Jima, for example, but I don't think they would have been in the same unit there.
As a Korean War vet and drafted, although I never was in Korea, but I have that title, I benefited greatly from the GI Bill. I got a master's degree entirely. I could never have done it without that help. What's the situation today? I'm just not well informed about the educational opportunities that come out of service, if any.
Yeah, there is, and Andrew mentioned this, the Congress passed and President Bush signed in June of 2008 the post-9/11 GI Bill, which basically provides support for current veterans that's roughly equivalent to World War II. World War II was a richer program that wasn't really continued with Korea. It was somewhat lesser. Vietnam was somewhat lesser. They're each far more generous than what the Iraq-Afghanistan veterans were having up until 2008. But right now there is a GI Bill available. It does provide educational opportunities, and I know that many of the veterans who enroll here are able to take advantage of that. I think what we have to do is, again, I talked about counseling, is get out and encourage these young men and young women to think about going to school, because the people who are joining the all-volunteer Army, if you look at where they're from, they are not coming from places, they didn't sort of think, well, I'm either going to join the Army or I'm going to MIT this fall. I haven't quite figured that out. They are focused on joining the military. They come from communities where the culture is leading them in that direction. I think we have to have better ways of telling them, okay, you can do this, you can do this. And I think that the proof certainly in the students who have been admitted to Dartmouth is that they do exceptionally well here. But we need to, the money is there. I think what we now have to do is point them in the direction of going to college. The unemployment is higher, as you know, as we've been reminded because of current debates in Congress among veterans. Homelessness is higher among veterans than non-veterans. We have to do a better job of this.
I'm a member of the class of '68, and I'm a Vietnam veteran. Approximately 10 to 15 years after we graduated, a study was done by the psychology department and by the VA Medical Center in White River Junction of our class. One of the things that they did was compile statistics on the number of our classmates and the other graduates in the Vietnam era at Dartmouth, as well as other Ivy League institutions. The numbers which I recall were that Dartmouth graduates in the Vietnam era, approximately 42 or 43% were in the military, not necessarily service in Vietnam. In part, I attribute that to three very robust ROTC programs when I was an undergraduate. And we at Dartmouth had the second greatest percentage of service during that era amongst the Ivy League institutions.
I'm not aware of that study. I would love to see it sometime. We should try to track it down. But that number, that 42, 43% would certainly be higher than I would have calculated. And mine is just based on looking at those who were commissioned at graduation, realizing that that's maybe a lower end, or we all know plenty of graduates of the 60s who did not take a commission but went on and enlisted. But at least looking at that group, it's probably more like 10 to 15% of a class who is getting commissioned at graduation. And you did lose a classmate in Vietnam. J. Rob Peacock was shot down in a plane over North Vietnam. And his name is on the wall.
Jim, as one who was commissioned at Dartmouth into the Navy, and having read recently in Ricketts' book, Making the Corps, he bemoans the fact that the military is not getting the brain power it needs, and he particularly pointed to the elite colleges. Do you think that there is any possibility that ROTC might return to the campus in the future in the full form rather than being from Norwich University?
Well, we have our own detachment here, and it's not quite when you were dean. It was a far looser arrangement. Right now, I think that there is we have our own unit. I was able to get from the Defense Department, the Department of the Army, more support for it a few years ago. I think the problem is, Dartmouth students are not joining. When you compare this generation of students to 68 or 58, a couple of things that I do think we have to remember. One is that 58 and 68, you face the draft. And facing the draft, you're saying, okay, I want to select my own terms as to where I'm going in. I'm going to go in as a Navy officer. I'm not going to become a grunt in the Army. And certainly if you look at the figures of those people who enlisted, I think about half of the officers in the Navy and during the Vietnam War acknowledge they're there because of pressure from the draft, and so that was there. Secondly, we have far better financial aid packages today. It's not necessary for anyone coming to Dartmouth who has financial need to sign up for ROTC in order to have financial aid to go in. And so I think that's just something that we're facing. I always have admired, I've tried to be supportive of those who were joining ROTC. I would love to see some expansion of that, but I'll tell you, Ralph, you don't make all the trips I've made down to the military hospitals and then try to recruit young men and women to join. I admire those who do. I encourage them. I want to support them every way I can, but I'm not a recruiter for the military either. These are different types of wars, and I think what you're seeing is again, where are the troops coming from who are serving over there? They're coming from rural South and West. more than any place else proportionally. And these are not places where you have as many students, as many young men and women thinking about going to elite colleges. And so it's a complicated issue. I do agree with you that we need to have more graduates of elite institutions serving in the military. There was a young man, I used to send something, whenever I learned about a Dartmouth graduate is serving in Iraq or Afghanistan, I would send a care package to them, and generally some maple candy and a Dartmouth cap and T-shirt, and I always sent a book of Robert Frost poems to them. And I got a letter back from one young man who was with the 101st Airborne, Michael. You know the instance I'm talking about. And he said, this is just great. He said, we go out on patrols every day, and most of the men in my platoon have never had a chance to really study poetry, so to sort of a letdown, I read poetry to them. And now that I've got Robert Frost, I'm reading that to them, and they sometimes ask me to read another poem. They like it. And if that sort of casual observation by a Dartmouth ROTC graduate who was serving as lieutenant in Iraq, if this doesn't establish that there is a value in having elite liberal arts graduates in the military, I don't know what does. And obviously there are a lot more value that we can provide. And I just think we need to find ways of doing that.
Hi, I simply want to thank you for a very, very powerful presentation. As a disabled American veteran, I never heard a presentation so powerful. And I spent 13 years in the Army. I've never heard the way you stage all the different wars, you know, up to today. That was very powerful. I totally thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you for what you've done.
If there aren't any more questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.